האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov and Dobra V'Yetcher. We are in the Zera Shimshon Os Ches, section number 8 on Parshas Vayakhel. This year, Vayakhel and Pekude, which usually go together as a double Parsha, are separated. So this is Os Ches in Parshas Vayakhel. And before we begin this section, we need to realize something very interesting about the discussions in the Torah regarding the building of the Mishkan and the order of things. So if you were to kind of take an overview of the Parshios towards the end of Sefer Shmos, in which the construction of the Mishkan is discussed, and that involves both the mitzvos from Hashem to Moshe in terms of building the Mishkan and all of its accoutrements, and also the psukim that talk with the collection of money and donations for the building, and then also the psukim discussing the actual building. If you were to look at all of that and take an overview, you would see that sometimes the building of the kalim, the utensils that were used in the Mishkan, for example, starting, of course, with the Aron HaKodesh itself, with the Aron that held the luchos, and then talking about the menorah and the two altars, the two mizbechos, and various other kalim, you would see that sometimes those things are talked about first as if they needed to be built first. And only later would the actual structure of the Mishkan be talked about. And when we talk about the structure of the Mishkan, there were boards and there were coverings, and that structure, the boards with the coverings, was called the Mishkan, and the kalim went inside of the Mishkan. So sometimes it talks about making the kalim, and then afterwards it talks about building the structure. And other times it talks about building the structure first, and then later, seemingly, apparently, making the kalim. So that issue, that kind of question, you might say, as to which things were made first and which things were made later, that issue and that question is what the Zera Shimshon is going to discuss. And as we'll see from the very first, from the start, from the Gemara and Brachos that he brings, there were different sources, and they came from in the Torah about this, and they came from different people or also different origins. Let's take a look. Os Ches, Parshas Vayakhel, Perek Tes de Brachos. If we look in a Gemara in the 9th Perek of Meseches Brachos, it says as follows: Omer Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Omer Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said that Rabbi Yonasan said, B'tzalel al shem chachmaso nikra. B'tzalel, and B'tzalel, of course, was received great fame in the Torah because he was named by Hashem. He was designated by Hashem to be the designer and the architect and the builder in charge of the whole Mishkan project. So they tell us B'tzalel al shem chachmaso nikra. B'tzalel's name, which can be broken down to mean in the shade of Hashem, or in the protection of Hashem, he received that name because of his great wisdom. And now the Gemara continues. At the time that Hashem said to Moshe, Lech emor leBetzalel, go and say to Betzalel, Aseh Mishkan Aron v'Kelim. Hashem said to Moshe, go and tell Betzalel to make the Mishkan, that's the structure, and then make the Aron, and then make the other utensils, and then once you've made the utensils, put them in the Mishkan that you built first. That's what Hashem said according to this Gemara. Holach Moshe ve'omar lehefech. And Moshe went and he said the opposite to Betzalel. Aseh Kalim, Aron, uMishkan. Moshe said to Betzalel, make the vessels, including the Aron, and then make the structure, then make the Mishkan itself, and the Kalim will wait until the Mishkan is completed, and then you'll bring the Kalim into the Mishkan. Amar lo, so Betzalel said to Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, our teacher, our master, minhago shel olam, the custom of the world when people build things, v'chule, etc. And I'll tell you what the Gemara says there, even though the Zera Shimshon leaves it out, because of course he expects us to know this passage in the Gemara very well, even maybe by heart. So what happens is, Betzalel is quoted as saying to Moshe, it's the custom of the world when people build the house to first build the outside structure and then make the beds and the couches and the tables and all the things that are go inside the house. But first you build the outside structure. Shema v'chule. And then continuing in the more, Betzalel says, perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu, perhaps Hashem actually said to you when he gave you the commandment, maybe he actually said to you, make the Mishkan, make the outer structure first, and then make the kalim. And perhaps you're saying it to me in a little bit of a different order than what Hashem said to you. That's what Betzalel said to Moshe. Amar lo, so Moshe said to Betzalel, Betzel kel hayisa. You were in the shade of Hashem. It's as if you were standing there somehow covered when Hashem spoke to me. V'yodata, and you knew what Hashem really said. So Moshe Rabbeinu is paying Betzalel the greatest compliment, and he's conceding and saying, you're right, Betzalel. You are absolutely correct. You're reminding me that when Hashem gave me the commandment, he first said, build the Mishkan, make the structure, and then make the Kalim. And I put things out of order when I communicated to you, Betzalel, and I said, make the Kalim first, make the utensils, the aron and the other things, the menorah and the table and all of the other things first, and then make the outer structure. I was changing things from the way Hashem said them, and you, Betzalel, you understood and knew exactly what Hashem must have said, and you put things in the right order about making the structure first, and that's precisely what Hashem had originally commanded me. Ad Kan, until here is a quote from the Gemara in Masechta Brachos. So the Zera Shimshon has two questions on this Gemara. Question number one, Sarach Iyun. We need to analyze and investigate Lama Moshe Hefech HaSeder. Why did Moshe change the order of what Hashem had said to him? Very fundamental, important question. Hashem comes to Moshe and says, tell Betzalel to make the structure and then the kalim, make the mishkan, the boards, the coverings, make the structure and then make the kalim. And Moshe turns around and goes to Betzalel and says, make the kalim first and then make the outer structure, then make the mishkan. Why? Why would Moshe ever do such a thing? That's question number one. Uma chochma hizo shel Betzalel. And what is this great wisdom that the Gemara is talking about that Betzalel apparently demonstrated in this incident? Imlo Omar Eladover Pashut. If he only said a very simple kind of obvious thing, Shehu Minhago Shel Olam, that it's the way of the world to first build the structure and then build the kalim, then build the articles that are going to go and the furniture that are go inside of the structure. It doesn't seem that Betzalel needed tremendous and profound wisdom and understanding to make that suggestion. All Betzalel was saying was, Moshe Rabbeinu, if you think about the way people set up their own houses and their own homes, first they make the outer structure, then they start working on the items that are going to go inside. Wonderful, good point. And Hashem and Moshe even conceded that that's what Hashem had originally commanded. But did that take tremendous wisdom? That was Betzalel demonstrating tremendous chokhmah, outstanding and extraordinary wisdom when he made that suggestion? Zera Shimshon says, I don't see it. We have to see where the extraordinary wisdom was. So those are the Zera Shimshon's two questions. We can begin, he begins to answer and to explain everything in the next paragraph. V'yesh lomar, and we can say, Shemitzad echad haya nira shekedushas aron v'chelim gedola mikedushas hamishkan. That the holiness, the sacredness of the aron and the other kalim, the other vessels that were in the Mishkan, that holiness is greater than the holiness of the structure itself, the Mishkan structure itself. Why would we say that? Shaharei hamikdash vehamishkan necherav. because as we know from Jewish history, ultimately the Beis HaMikdash and before that the Mishkan were destroyed. The actual structures were destroyed. V'kelim b'kedushasan heim omdim. But the Aaron and the other Kelim maintained their holiness and continued to exist even after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. V'Yoshio HaMelech Gonzam, and Yoshio the king hid them, buried them, put them away for safekeeping. V'Habayis Necharav, and why was the actual structure destroyed? Bishvil lahatzil es Yisrael, in order to save the Jewish people. Shetzedaka asa imanu, because it was a kindness, an act of charity and kindness and mercy that Hashem did for us at the time that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Sheshofach hamasa, we're now at the top of the next column, that he poured his anger al ha'etzim v'al ha'avonim, on the wood and on the stones, the actual building materials of the Beis HaMikdash, of the outer structure. And you can see that's based on a medrash of Eicha Rabbah. So the Zera Shimshon says that we can measure Kedusha sometimes, the holiness we can measure sometimes by how what is the end result, what ends up happening to something. And when it comes to the Kelim of the Beis HaMikdash, they remained past the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the Kelim were not destroyed. They remained, and they were ultimately buried and hidden away for the time of the third Beis HaMikdash, God willing. So that shows us, the Zera Shimshon says, that they had a higher level of Kedusha. They had a higher level of holiness than the outside structure, which was destroyed. And the Zera Shimshon parenthetically points out that when the structure of the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and this of course would apply to both the first and the second Beis HaMikdash, this was a horrific, terrible catastrophe and tragedy, but it was actually an act of kindness, because Hashem said, instead of taking out my anger on the people, I'm going to take out my anger on the building, on the edifice. So we understand that. Continuing. Ulefi ma'ide kaimalon, and according to what we hold in a different, based on a different Gemara in Masechta Brachos, malin bakodesh, that we should always go up in holiness. Meaning, if we're ever presented with a situation in which we have to deal with things that are on a lower level of Kedusha and things that are on a higher level of Kedusha, we should always start at the lower level of holiness and malin bakodesh, go up to the higher level of Kedusha, as opposed to what we should refrain and avoid from doing whenever possible, which is starting at the higher level of Kedusha and then going down to a lower level of Kedusha. The Gemara says, Chazal teach us that that's not the right way to go. Start at the lower level of holiness and build and work our way up to the higher level of holiness. So the Zera Shimshon now is going to apply that rule and say, according to that, Tzorich lasos techila hamishkan. First, Bnei Yisrael, Betzalel, the architect, needed to make the Mishkan, the structure, the achar kach hakelim, and afterwards the utensils and the vessels. Why? Because the Zera Shimshon just taught us that the Mishkan, the structure itself, had a lower level of holiness than the kelim, than the articles inside. And so therefore, Betzalel, that the Zera Shimshon saying that fits in what Betzalel's suggestion was to make the Mishkan first and start with the lower level of holiness and then work his way up to make the Kelim inside, which had a higher level of Kedusha. Omnam, however, mitzad acher, from another perspective, Gedola Kedushas HaMishkan veHaMikdash. We can argue that the structure of the Mishkan and later of the Beis HaMikdash were actually holier than the Kelim inside. Kemoshe matzinu benov uvegivon umishkan Shiloh, as we find in three places where the Mishkan encamped once Bnei Yisrael came into the land of Israel, meaning that once the Mishkan was built in the Midbar, then of course it served the needs of the Jewish people and stayed with them and traveled with them. They set it up and took it down all through the 40 years in the Midbar. Once they came into Eretz Canaan and conquered Eretz Canaan, then the Mishkan stayed in Shiloh and also had a period of time in Nov and a period of time in Givon. And what do we see in all those places? Shalosh Sharsa Sham Hashchina. The Shechina did not dwell in the Mishkan when it was in those places. Lefisha Adayin Lo Nivne Habayis, because a permanent structure had not yet been constructed to take the place of the Mishkan. So that shows us that even though all of the kalim were there, all of the different utensils, the aron and the menorah and the shulchan and the mizbeach hazahav and the mizbeach haketores and the kior and all of the different vessels of the Mishkan were present when the Mishkan stood in Shiloh and Nov and Givon. Nonetheless, the Shechina did not rest until Shlomo Melech built the permanent structure, the first Beis HaMikdash, and then the Shechina began to dwell there, which shows you that it was the structure, the permanent structure that had the higher level of Kedusha. And according to this, hayitzorich lasos techila hakelim, then the kalim, the utensils, should have been made first and designed first because they had a lower level of holiness. The achar kacha mishkan, and afterwards, then we go from the lower level of holiness to making the mishkan, the structure which had a higher level of holiness. So let's pause here to recap before we continue. So the Zera Shimshon has taught us, based on the Gemara in the 9th parak of Masechta Brachos, that there seems to be a question and a difference of opinion between Hashem and Moshe and Betzalel about which items needed to be made first. According to Hashem's original command and Betzalel's later proposal to Moshe, the Mishkan should have been made first, the outer structure, and then the kalim, then the different articles that would go inside. But according to what Moshe said to Betzalel, and this we can see in Parshas Truma, first the Aron and the kalim should be made, and later the Mishkan should be made. And so the Zera Shimshon says that's not just a disagreement or a difference of opinion that's kind of haphazard. It's based on a very, very important distinction or discussion of Malin Bakodesh, of always going from lower holiness to to higher holiness. And the question becomes, which had the higher holiness, the kalim, the utensils, or the structure? And Zera Shimshon says there's two different ways of looking at that. On the one hand, you might see the kalim, the utensils, as having the higher level of kedusha, in which case the structure, the Mishkan, should be built first, and that's what Betzalel said, and only later the kalim, because they have a higher level of kedusha. But on the other hand, from a different perspective, the Mishkan, the structure itself, might have, you can argue, have the higher level of holiness, in which case first you should make the kalim, the utensils, and then work your way up to the higher level of holiness of the structure itself. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu proposed and apparently believed. So now we need to understand further how this disagreement developed and played out. Vehine Amru Zichron Levracha b'Meseches Sota. The Chazal say in a Gemara in Sota, Shem Moshe v'David lo sholtu sonehem b'maaseh yedehem. Regarding things that Moshe Rabbeinu and David HaMelech made, their enemies could never take control or destroy the things that they made with their hands. So if Moshe Rabbeinu and David HaMelech made something, then it couldn't be destroyed. Ukemoshe Kosu HaMekubalim, and like the Kabbalists teach, She'im Hayim Moshe Nichnas La'aretz, if Moshe had entered the land of Israel, and he had been involved in building the Beis HaMikdash, no enemy of the Jewish people would ever have been able to damage and certainly not destroy the Beis HaMikdash if Moshe Rabbeinu had come into Eretz Yisrael and built it. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tziva leMoshe, Hashem commanded to Moshe, Aseh Mishkan, Aron v'Kelim. Make the structure first, and then make the Aron and the other utensils. So Hashem, from Hashem's perspective, knowing everything that Hashem knew, which of course is everything, Hashem said the Mishkan has the structure has the lower level of holiness, and the Kalim have a higher level of holiness, and therefore make the structure first and afterwards the Kalim. Why? Mipnei shehaya yodea, because Hashem knew, of course, shesofo shel Moshe lomus b'midbar. Moshe was ultimately going to die in the Midbar, and he was not going to enter Eretz Yisrael, and he was not going to be able to build a permanent Beis HaMikdash that could never be destroyed, because he wasn't going to enter the land of Israel to be able to do that. The Sofo shel Mikdash lechorev, and Hashem knew that ultimately, after many, many, many years, the Beis HaMikdash was going to be destroyed. Umipnei shemalin bakodesh, and since we always go up in holiness, again, based on that other Gemara in Masechta Brachos, tzarich lasos techila hamishkan. You must make the structure first, because a structure that's going to be destroyed has a lower level of holiness, according to what the Zera Shimshon is teaching us, than the Kalim, which were not going to be destroyed. So the sign of which thing had the higher level of holiness is which was going to be destroyed. Since Hashem knew the structure of the Beis HaMikdash was not going to be built by Moshe Rabbeinu, and it was ultimately going to be destroyed, while the Kalim would be ultimately hidden and not destroyed, Hashem said to Moshe, build the structure first and then build the Kalim. However, we're going to see that Moshe Rabbeinu had a different perspective, a very different perspective. Next paragraph, bottom paragraph in the second column. Omnam, however, Moshe shehaya mitzapeh lahachnis Yisrael la'aretz, Moshe, who was anticipating bringing Bnei Yisrael into the land. Moshe didn't have a thought in his mind about not entering Eretz Yisrael or dying in the Midbar. Moshe's everything he lived for, everything he aspired to, was to bring Bnei Yisrael into the land, and of course, then build the Beis HaMikdash. So and he knew that no enemy could destroy a Beis HaMikdash that he was involved in building. Omar lo, so he, Moshe Rabbeinu, with that mindset said to Bezalel, Aseh Kalim, Aaron u'Mishkan, make the utensils and the Aaron first, and then make the Mishkan, because from Moshe Rabbeinu's perspective, the Mishkan represented the structure, and the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, the permanent structure, would never be destroyed in Moshe Rabbeinu's mind because of what he thought was going to happen. And since it would never be destroyed, it would have the higher level of Kedusha and holiness. And therefore, he told Bezalel, build the Kalim first, which have lower holiness, and then work your way up, Malin Bakodesh, to the outer structure, which has the highest level of holiness. U'Betzalel, and Betzalel lo rotza lo hashiv al zeh beferish. Betzalel did not wish to reply openly to Moshe Rabbeinu's proposal. He didn't want to come right out and say, Moshe Rabbeinu, how do you know that the Mishkan and the outer structure is going to last forever because you're going to go into Israel and build it? He didn't want to, he couldn't say those words to Moshe Rabbeinu. Ella, but rather, Heishiv lo mimino ga'olam. Rather, he replied, as the Gemara quoted him, by talking about the custom of the world. And he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, isn't it the normal way of things that you build the outer structure first, and then you make the other things that are going to go inside the structure? And therefore, perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu, perhaps that's what Hashem said to you, right? That was Bezalel's approach. And then after saying that kind of, making that kind of gentle point, Bezalel said, perhaps that's what Hashem said to you. Meaning, Bezalel was alluding to Moshe Rabbeinu and saying to him, how do you know for sure that the structure has a higher level of severity, of sanctity, of stringency and halacha from the utensils? How do you know that? Maybe the utensils have the higher level of holiness, in which case the structure should be made first and only later the utensils. Because if you don't say that that's what Bezalel had in mind, Kash al Betzalel. Then we have a very strong question al Betzalel. My kusha hizo, what kind of question was he asking Moshe Lomar to say, sheminhag ha'olam hu lehefech, that the custom of the world was the opposite of Moshe, of what Moshe Rabbeinu was telling him to do? Meaning, Betzalel must have had something else in mind besides his kind of cover story about what is the custom of the world. That can't be what he was truly basing his argument on. He might have said those words, but that's not really the point he was trying to make. Well, how do we know that? Dilma gezeres hamakom hu lasos keseder hazeh. Because who would care about what the world does? Perhaps Hashem specifically said to Moshe, forget what anyone else in the world does and how they build things. I want you to tell Betzalel to make the kalim first and then make the outer structure, the Mishkan. And if that's what Hashem said, then there's nothing to talk about. It would be completely irrelevant and even absurd for Betzalel to say, okay, maybe that's what Hashem told you, Moshe. That's what Hashem told you to tell me, but that doesn't go along with what other people do when they build things. Yes, there are many things Hashem does, commands that don't necessarily go along with the minhag shel olam, with the way things are done in the rest of the world. And the Zera Shimshon points that out. He gives an example. K'moshe tziva haklaim. For example, Hashem commanded that klaim, mixed articles. In this case, we're talking about wool and linen, which we call shatnez, which the Torah calls shatnez. Hashem said they can be in the bevigdei kahuna. Wool and linen can be mixed in the garments that the Kohanim wore in the Mishkan in the Beis HaMikdash. Af al pi, even though shahakloyim, these mixed things, mixing of wool and linen, also the Torah forbids you to do it, right? So, but if something's a gezeres hamakam hamelech, if Hashem commands us to do something, then that ends any questioning and discussion. We can't say, Hashem, we're not going to put wool and linen in the clothing of the Kohanim, even though you're commanding us to do it, because we see in a different place you commanded us not to wear wool and linen. Hashem is the one giving the commands. So Hashem has the right to make an exception, of course. And so Hashem says, even though in general, Jewish people should not wear any clothing that has a mixture of wool and linen, the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash can wear mixtures of wool and linen, and that's my command, and that's the end of it. Betzalel also b'chochma, but definitely Betzalel used great wisdom and subtlety here. Lahastir hadavar, to hide the matter, to phrase it in a way that the words he was actually saying were only covering the real argument he was making, bifnei Moshe, in front of Moshe, kedei shelo yargish, in order that Moshe, chas v'sholem, should not feel any lack of respect from Betzalel, as if Betzalel was questioning him or talking about the possibility that he might not ultimately go into the land of Israel. Betzalel had an understanding of the issues, a very clear understanding of the issues in the rule of Malin Bakodesh, of elevating in holiness. However, he used his wisdom to phrase things to Moshe Rabbeinu in a way to make it look like he was talking about something different, the minhag ha'olam, the common way of building things, when really what he was alluding to or hinting to Moshe is that perhaps Hashem had given Moshe a different order to the command than Moshe Rabbeinu had spoken to Betzalel about. And then all of this was confirmed when Moshe said, you are correct. It's as if you were standing there and secretly listening in on our conversation when Hashem commanded me, because Hashem in fact said, make the structure first and then make the kalim, as opposed to making the kalim first and only later making the structure. Ve'od, last paragraph, ve'od efshar lomar, and we can also possibly say, sheheshiv lo miminhago shel olam, that when Betzalel mentioned the custom of the world and how the world does things, he was also alluding to something else. Klomar, and he meant to say, sheminhag ha'olam hu liyos chotim, one of the most customary and characteristic things of people in the world is that they commit sins, they do averas. Ve'im Yisrael yechta'u, and if the Jews commit serious sins, and that is the way the world works, is that people do sin and sometimes commit egregious sins, ve'hamishkan yeh kayam, And if that were to happen, and yet the Mishkan or ultimately the Beis HaMikdash would be made in such a way that it would last forever and it could never be destroyed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu yeh tzarech lishpoch chamoso al Yisrael, then God forbid Hashem would have to let the Beis HaMikdash continue to exist, but take out his anger on the Jewish people themselves. God forbid. V'ha'olam yeh tohu vavohu, and then the whole world would go back to a stage of chaos and emptiness, because if God forbid the Jewish people, if God forbid Hashem took out his full anger on the Jews and they were destroyed and there was no observance of mitzvahs in the world, then the whole world would revert chas v'sholem to its original state of chaos, of tohu vavohu. And so in order to make sure that didn't happen, things needed to develop in such a way that a Beis HaMikdash structure could be destroyed, thereby preserving the Jewish people, preserving Klal Yisrael for the future, and ultimately, God willing, it should come soon for the Geula, the redemption, and the building of the third Beis HaMikdash. Yasher koach to everyone for participating this week, and especially for Dimitri for joining us in person. And we hope everyone will be with us together again when we learn Zera Shimshon next week.